story you want? Well, I went to a rehab situation. Yeah, one.
She had the voice of a jazz goddess, the beauty of a Hollywood star, and the soul of an R&B queen. Yet while others soared into superstardom, Miki Howard was quietly pushed to the sidelines, overlooked by the very industry she helped shape. Raised in the shadow of gospel royalty, she sang with the ache of someone who had lived 1,000 lives and somehow survived them all. So why isn't Miki Howard a household name? Why does a voice this powerful, this soulful, remain a secret whispered among true music lovers instead of an anthem celebrated on every stage? This is the untold story of brilliance and betrayal, of resilience and heartbreak, of a woman whose truth cut deeper than the industry could ever package. Born into a world of legends, surrounded by voices that defined Black American music, Miki was destined to create a sound uniquely her own. Her rise would be dazzling, her talent undeniable. But along the way came storms, industry politics, personal heartbreak, substance abuse, and the cruel silence of fame that fades too soon. This is more than a music story. This is a survival story. This is the story of Miki Howard, the voice the world should never have ignored. Alicia Michelle Howard, known to the world as Miki Howard, entered the world on the 30th of September 1960 in Chicago, Illinois. On paper, her childhood seemed like destiny, the daughter of two gospel greats, born into a lineage of voices that had already altered the soundscape of American music. But behind the glittering associations and the famous names who floated in and out of her life, young Miki carried a secret weight, an ache to be seen, to be heard, to matter on her own terms. Her mother, Josephine Howard, was no ordinary singer. She was a founding member of the groundbreaking gospel group The Caravans, the ensemble that helped shape modern gospel alongside titans like Shirley Caesar and Albertina Walker. Their harmonies were thunderous, their presence legendary. Josephine was on the road often, crisscrossing America to deliver the good news in song. For fans of gospel, she was a beacon. For Miki, she was both inspiration and absence. Her father, Clay Graham, was himself a figure of renown. As a member of the Pilgrim Jubilees, his voice carried the fervor of the Black church into countless congregations. Yet for his daughter, he was more of a rumor than a presence. His career kept him distant, his responsibilities scattered, and the relationship between father and daughter never developed into something solid. Miki grew up with his name, but rarely with his comfort. What surrounded her instead was a rotating cast of legends, household names to the world, but aunties and uncles to her. When Josephine went on the road, she often left her daughter in the care of fellow luminaries. Aretha Franklin would sometimes watch her. Mahalia Jackson, the queen of gospel herself, played the role of caretaker. Members of the staple singers became stand-in family. Imagine being rocked to sleep by voices that could fill stadiums or move congregations to tears. For Miki, these voices weren't coming from records. They were coming from the living room. It sounds idyllic, and in some ways it was. Few children grow up with such proximity to genius. But Miki would later recall that this closeness to greatness came with its own shadows. People would come to see my mom, she once reflected, but they didn't really see me. The house was full of laughter, rehearsals, and music, yet she felt an invisible emptiness. Affection was scarce. Attention was fleeting. She was surrounded by legends, but starved of intimacy. That paradox planted an early longing inside her. She wanted more than to exist as someone's daughter or someone's responsibility. She wanted to be recognized in her own right, not just for who her parents were or who her caretakers happened to be. It was a hunger not for applause, but for acknowledgement. That hunger would drive her entire artistic journey. In the quiet moments, she turned the noise of the household into her private classroom. She mimicked the gospel shouts she heard during rehearsals. She tried on the soulful moans of visiting singers, adding her own twists. She toyed with jazz scats, playing with phrasing until it became something uniquely hers. These were not just childish games. They were the first sketches of a sound that would one day stand out in the world of R&B. By the time Miki entered her teenage years, it was clear that music wasn't just in her environment, it was in her blood, her bones, her very breath. Teachers and friends noticed her voice carried an unusual texture, a mix of velvet and grit. But at home, recognition was harder to come by. She was still, in her own words, a lonely girl in a crowded house. That loneliness grew into restlessness. The golden childhood seen from the outside began to feel like a cage on the inside. Constant travel, fractured relationships, and the instability of being raised by a community rather than a present family left scars. By her mid-teens, she had grown tired of waiting for someone to see her. So, she made a choice that was both bold and dangerous. She ran away. Her destination was Los Angeles. For a girl raised in the pews of Chicago's gospel world, LA was another planet. The late 1970 seconds in that city pulsed with funk, disco, and soul. It was a place where music wasn't just sacred, it was sensual, rebellious, and sometimes reckless. For Miki, it represented both risk and freedom. Alone in a vast new city, she could have easily been swallowed by its chaos. But instead of getting lost, she found exactly what she had been searching for: a stage. The underground clubs and jam sessions of Los Angeles became her new sanctuary. Here, she wasn't just Josephine Howard's daughter or the girl left in Aretha's care. She was a voice, raw and undeniable. Every note carried the loneliness of her childhood, the yearning to be seen, the resilience of someone who had already endured too much neglect. This was no longer the story of a child living in the shadows of giants. This was the beginning of a story about an artist determined to cast her own. Los Angeles in the late 1970 seconds was a world apart from Chicago's gospel corridors. The city pulsed with funk, soul, disco, and an underground scene that welcomed anyone brave enough to step to the microphone. For a teenager running from the emptiness of her childhood home, it was both intoxicating and terrifying. But for Miki Howard, it was also the perfect classroom. She had no safety net, no famous parents standing behind her. If she was going to survive, it would be by proving herself in front of strangers night after night. Her first stages weren't glamorous theaters or high-profile showcases. They were clubs tucked into corners of South Central, spaces where musicians gathered after hours to jam until dawn. The air was heavy with cigarette smoke and ambition. Bands improvised grooves that stretched for 20 minutes. Singers tested out voices shaped by both church and street corners. In those spaces, Miki found her tribe. The loneliness that had followed her from Chicago seemed to dissolve under stage lights, replaced by a thrill she'd never felt before. Here, she wasn't just another daughter of gospel legends, she was herself, raw and undeniable. It didn't take long for her voice to attract attention. Word spread quickly in those circles. There was a new girl in town with a sound that blended church, trained power, jazz phrasing, and the emotional urgency of soul. One group in particular was listening Side Effect, a funk and R&B outfit known for slick arrangements and bold experimentation. They had just lost their lead singer, Sylvia Street, James, and were searching for someone who could not only fill the gap, but redefine the group's future. When Miki auditioned, it wasn't just a performance. It was a declaration. Her voice wasn't merely strong. It carried texture, a sultry edge, and an emotional honesty that made every lyric sound lived in. The church was in her lungs, jazz in her phrasing, and defiance in her tone. She didn't just sing the notes, she inhabited them. Side Effect was floored. This runaway teenager from Chicago walked into their world and owned it. Joining Side Effect catapulted her from underground clubs to professional stages. She became their lead vocalist, stepping into a spotlight that once seemed reserved for others. Albums like After the Rain and Portraits bore her voice, and audiences quickly noticed there was something magnetic about her presence. She wasn't just keeping up with a seasoned band, she was commanding attention in her own right. Her stagecraft set her apart. Audiences spoke of how she locked eyes with listeners, as if singing directly to them. She carried herself with a cool confidence, never distant but always in control. Behind every lyric was a story of heartbreak, of longing, of survival. People weren't just entertained, they were moved. In packed clubs, where crowds often came looking for escapism, Miki gave them something rarer: truth. But as much as Side Effect gave her a platform, it was also clear that Miki Howard could not remain confined within a group. Her voice was not built to blend indefinitely, it was built to lead. The more she performed, the more undeniable her individuality became. Musicians noticed, producers noticed, and eventually, record executives noticed. By the mid-1980 seconds, Miki took the leap that would define her career. She went solo. It was a gamble, but one that paid off almost immediately. Her debut solo album, Come Share My Love, released in 1986, was more than just a collection of songs. It was a declaration of identity. The title track climbed to number 5 on the Billboard R&B chart, instantly cementing her as a force to be reckoned with. With its sultry elegance and emotional depth, the album announced that Miki Howard had arrived not as someone's daughter, not as a band member, but as her own artist. The momentum only grew. In 1987, she released Love Confessions, further solidifying her reputation as one of the most compelling voices of her generation. The single Baby Be Mine soared into the top 5, a lush ballad that showcased both her vocal control and her vulnerability. Critics and fans alike began comparing her to contemporaries like Phyllis Hyman and Anita Baker, high praise that spoke to her artistry, but also to the emotional resonance she carried into every note. Yet even amid this early success, the same hunger that had driven her from Chicago to Los Angeles remained alive in her. Miki wasn't simply chasing chart positions. She was still chasing recognition, the kind that would validate all the years of being overlooked in her own home. She sang not just to entertain, but to prove to herself, to her family, to the industry that she was worthy of being seen. The industry was beginning to take her seriously, but the road ahead was not without its challenges. Behind the scenes, she was still grappling with the shadows of her past, the lingering ache of abandonment, and the emotional void that had never fully healed. The stage provided escape and affirmation, but when the lights dimmed, the old feelings returned. Still, the trajectory was unmistakable. From a runaway teenager in smoky LA clubs to a rising solo star on the Billboard charts, Miki Howard had transformed her pain into power. She had fought her way into the spotlight, and for the first time in her life, the world was watching her, not the legends around her. What no one could predict was just how high she would rise and how steep the cost of that rise would become. By the late 1980 seconds, Miki Howard was no longer the young runaway singing in smoky clubs or even the standout lead of Side Effect. She was a fully realized solo artist, standing firmly in the center of the R&B stage. And in 1989, with the release of her self-titled album Miki Howard, she reached the summit of her commercial success. The album was a triumph, both artistically and commercially. It produced her first #1 R&B single, Ain't Nothin' in the World, a song that captured the energy of the era while showcasing the vocal prowess that made her impossible to ignore. But the true centerpiece was the haunting ballad Love Under New Management. Unlike so many polished pop tracks of the time, this song felt lived in. Its gospel-tinged delivery carried the weight of someone who had walked through devastation and found a fragile form of redemption. Audiences felt it immediately. This wasn't performance, it was testimony. Miki wasn't just singing pain, she was purging it. With this album, her artistry reached new heights. The comparisons to Anita Baker and Phyllis Hyman became louder, but what made Miki unique was the raw intimacy of her work. Where others offered elegance, she added edge. Where others sang of love in abstract terms, she sang with scars exposed. Her voice carried smoke and silk, heartbreak and hope, often in the same phrase. Listeners who pressed play weren't just hearing songs, they were stepping into her life. At the same time, her personal life was playing out like a parallel drama. She had fallen deeply in love with Gerald Levert, himself R&B royalty as the son of Eddie Levert of the OJs. Together, they seemed unstoppable, two young stars at the height of their powers, embodying passion on stage and off. To the public, they were a glamorous pairing, a power couple that symbolized the best of contemporary soul. But privately, the reality was much more volatile. Their relationship was a storm. It was passionate, fiery, and intoxicating, but it was also marked by jealousy, infidelity, and creative envy. Both were children of musical legacies, both were carrying the weight of expectations, and both had tempers stoked by fame's relentless pressure. For Miki, Gerald was both muse and torment. Their love lifted her, but it also broke her. When the relationship unraveled, it left scars that bled directly into her music. The turbulence extended beyond her love life. During this period, Miki gave birth to a son. Industry whispers began swirling about the child's paternity, with some assuming Gerald was the father and others, including Miki in later interviews, suggesting otherwise. The speculation fed tabloids and fueled gossip, but it also created an emotional storm in her private world. For a woman already struggling to feel seen beyond her voice, the scrutiny was crushing. Meanwhile, the industry was demanding conformity. Record labels pushed for packaged personas and radio-ready singles, but Miki didn't bend easily. She wasn't chasing trends or crafting herself into a brand. She was an artist in the truest sense, focused on honesty rather than marketability. That refusal to conform, however, left her vulnerable in a business that often valued image over integrity. It was during these same years that another shadow crept into her life: substance abuse. What began as an occasional escape from the pressures of fame slowly turned into dependency. Cocaine, always lurking in the background of the entertainment world, became a silent co-star in her story. At first, it provided temporary relief from exhaustion and emotional turmoil, but soon it was chaining her down. As the 1,990 seconds approached, the cracks in Miki's seemingly unstoppable rise began to show. She missed shows, and studio sessions grew strained. Her record label, once confident in her star power, began to lose patience. Radio programmers, always fickle, started drifting toward younger, more malleable voices. The media, eager for the spectacle of a fallen diva, circled hungrily. And yet, even as these struggles mounted, her artistry remained intact. The brilliance of her voice never faltered. Songs like Love Under New Management remained proof that she could channel devastation into beauty. Audiences still responded, even as the industry's interest began to cool. Fans came to her shows not just to be entertained, but to witness someone who turned pain into art right before their eyes. The late 1,980 seconds into the cusp of the 1,990 seconds were the years when Miki Howard stood at the peak of her career, commercially successful, critically respected, and adored by those who recognized her rare gift. But behind the glamorous surface, storms were already raging. The very qualities that made her unforgettable, her honesty, her refusal to play a role, her vulnerability, were the same qualities that made her an easy target for an industry that demanded perfection and reinvention. This was the paradox of Miki Howard's breakthrough. She had finally achieved the recognition she had long hungered for, but it came at a cost that would soon threaten everything she had built. Her rise was meteoric. The applause was deafening. But just behind the curtain, her foundation was beginning to crack. And when the lights dimmed, she would find herself battling not just the industry but her own demons, demons that would define the next chapter of her story. At the height of her fame, when her voice was filling radio waves and her image graced magazine pages, Miki Howard's private world was unraveling. The same intensity that made her music unforgettable also fueled a personal life marked by heartbreak, volatility, and escape. The most visible chapter of that turmoil was her romance with Gerald Levert, a relationship that defined an era of her life, but also nearly destroyed her. To fans, their union looked like perfection. Gerald, the charismatic son of Eddie Levert from the OJs, was already carving his own path in R&B. Miki, with her smoky vocals and soulful delivery, seemed the perfect match. Together, they were a fantasy, a pair of artists bound by passion and music. On stage, their chemistry was undeniable. Offstage, however, it was another story. Miki would later describe their love as both a gift and a wound. "It lifted me, and it broke me," she admitted in interviews. Their relationship was marked by constant highs and devastating lows. They inspired each other creatively, but jealousy and infidelity clouded the bond. What might have been a source of stability instead became a storm, and when the storm finally collapsed, the fallout left her raw, vulnerable, and searching for solace in the wrong places. For someone who had spent her childhood feeling unseen, the unraveling of such a public relationship cut deeply. She had hoped that in Gerald she had found not just a partner but an anchor. Instead, she was left adrift, carrying the weight of heartbreak in the same arms that once carried applause. That heartbreak cracked open doors she had long tried to keep closed. Drugs, which had lingered at the periphery of her world, slipped inside. What began as the occasional escape, a way to dull the ache of rejection and the pressures of fame, soon turned into dependence. A hit to take the edge off became nights that stretched into blurred weekends. Those weekends blurred into lost years. The industry, always eager for a spectacle, began to whisper. Rumors of erratic behavior surfaced. Studio sessions were missed, producers walked away, frustrated, and bookings became uncertain. What executives once saw as individuality, they now labeled as instability. For a black woman in a notoriously unforgiving business, there was little room for error. And Miki was giving the industry exactly the excuse it needed to turn its back. But behind the headlines and the whispers was a woman in pain, struggling to keep herself intact while still trying to be a mother. By this time, Miki had 3 children. Balancing motherhood with the chaos of addiction was an impossible task. Some days she was present, fiercely protective and full of love. Other days, she disappeared into the fog of her struggles. For her children, there was no certainty which version of their mother would walk through the door. For Miki, the guilt of those inconsistencies only deepened her spiral. And yet, even in her most fractured moments, music remained her lifeline. She once reflected that when everything else, money, respect, relationships was gone, the music stayed. Singing became her therapy, her anchor in the storm. On stage, even if the crowd was smaller, she could still find pieces of herself. Her voice, wounded but unbroken, carried her through nights when nothing else could. The tabloids painted her as a cautionary tale, the fallen diva. But the truth was more complicated. Miki wasn't falling because she lacked discipline or talent. She was falling because she was human, because the unresolved wounds of her childhood, the heartbreak of her love life, and the relentless pressures of an unforgiving industry all collided at once. This chapter of her story was not about the music she made, but about the battles she fought simply to keep going. Love had lifted her and shattered her. Addiction had numbed her and chained her. Yet through it all, one thing remained constant: her voice. It was the one thing the industry couldn't take, the one thing drugs couldn't silence, the one thing she still trusted. The 1,990 seconds didn't just change the sound of R&B, they changed the rules of who got to survive. As hip-hop beats began shaping the charts and youth became the currency of success, artists who didn't fit the mold were quietly pushed aside. For Miki Howard, whose voice was steeped in jazz, gospel, and raw emotion, the shift was devastating. Radio programmers stopped spinning the kind of lush, vulnerable ballads that had made her a star in the 1,980 seconds. Labels stopped investing in voices that didn't fit neatly into a new marketing plan. What had once been her strength, her refusal to conform, her timeless authenticity, was suddenly branded a weakness. Industry executives whispered that her sound was dated. Younger, more malleable artists were easier to shape into trends. And so the calls slowed, the opportunities shrank, and Miki found herself on the wrong side of a machine that chewed up and spit out talent with alarming speed. The consequences were brutal. There were months when she couldn't secure a single booking. Promoters ignored her calls. Her name was sometimes misspelled on small flyers, tucked beneath tribute acts and novelty performers. Once headlining national tours, she now fought for a place on stages borrowed from others. The silence was more than professional, it was personal. For someone who had built her life around music, being erased felt like losing oxygen. Yet even as the industry turned its back, Miki refused to vanish. She sang wherever she could: small theaters, clubs, community festivals. The crowds were smaller, but they were loyal. Fans brought worn vinyl records for her to sign, or cried in the front row because her songs had once carried them through heartbreak and despair. In those moments, she remembered why she sang, not for charts, but for connection. Still, survival was far from glamorous. Rumors of financial ruin swirled. There were lawsuits, health scares, and even periods of homelessness. The tabloids framed her as a cautionary tale, a tragic figure who had squandered her gifts. But the reality was more cruel. She hadn't squandered them. She had been abandoned by an industry that had no patience for imperfection, no tolerance for age, and no respect for authenticity when it clashed with profit. Even in the midst of this darkness, flashes of brilliance reminded the world of her power. In 1992, she portrayed Billie Holiday in Spike Lee's Malcolm X. The role was brief but magnetic, a haunting mirror of her own struggles as a singer discarded too soon by the world. Critics took notice, recognizing the authenticity she brought to the screen. For a moment, it seemed like a new chapter might open. But the doors of Hollywood, much like the music industry, were not generous to women like Miki. The moment passed, and she slipped once more into the margins. Through the 2000s, she popped up in niche tours and smaller projects, but the battles behind the scenes never fully relented. Addiction continued to shadow her steps. Financial instability meant some nights ended not in luxury hotels but in motels or borrowed rooms. Each attempt at rebuilding was met with the stubborn reality that the industry had already moved on. Then, in 2010, something remarkable happened. TV1 aired her episode of Unsung, and millions of viewers were introduced or reintroduced to the woman behind the voice. Miki spoke candidly about her past, the heartbreak, the addiction, the betrayals, the survival. She didn't sugarcoat, she didn't perform, she told the truth. And in that truth, people found her again. The response was electric. She trended on social media. Talk shows invited her. Younger artists cited her as an influence. Old fans remembered why they loved her in the first place. Even then, the road was not easy. She wasn't filling arenas or topping charts. Instead, she performed in intimate jazz clubs, church fundraisers, or community theaters. Her albums like Private Collection and I Choose to Be Happy didn't storm the Billboard charts, but they resonated with the people who needed them most. Stripped down, emotional, fearless, they told the story of a survivor still fighting to be heard. The industry may have erased her name from its headlines, but Miki Howard refused to let it erase her voice. In another era, Miki Howard might have been a household name. With her smoky timbre, perfect phrasing, and emotional depth, she had all the ingredients of a superstar. Yet instead of global domination, her legacy has unfolded in subtler, more enduring ways, less about charts and awards, more about whispers among artists, fans, and families who pass her songs like treasures too sacred to lose. From the very beginning, critics and listeners compared her to giants. She was often placed in the same conversations as Phyllis Hyman and Anita Baker, vocalists whose control and emotional intensity redefined modern soul. The comparisons were flattering, but they also revealed an industry blind spot. For all her brilliance, no major label ever went all in on Miki Howard. No glossy campaign positioned her as the face of a movement. She was celebrated, yes, but never elevated. As insiders often put it, she was the one who got away, a voice that could have, should have, changed the game. Still, what the machine overlooked, real people did not. Fans who discovered her work became loyal for life. They didn't just listen casually, they carried her records like companions. Her ballads played at weddings, heartbreaks, and funerals. Songs like Love Under New Management became anthems of resilience, helping listeners navigate their own devastations. This was Miki's gift. She didn't sing about pain abstractly. She sang the way pain feels messy, aching, sometimes hopeful, sometimes defeated. Younger artists also took note. Long before the neo-soul revival of the 2000s, Miki was embodying the very qualities that artists like Erykah Badu and Jill Scott would later be celebrated for: vulnerability, authenticity, and a refusal to compromise artistry for market trends. Many of these younger singers grew up with her vinyl records spinning in their homes. They absorbed not only her riffs but her fearlessness, her insistence that music should tell the truth, even when the truth hurts. Play one of her ballads today, and you can still feel that truth. The room shifts. Her voice cuts through decades like a hot blade through silk. It carries not only melody but memory, the betrayal of lovers, the longing for peace, the struggle for dignity, and the quiet triumph of still standing. Few artists can capture such a spectrum of human experience in a single note, but Miki did it effortlessly. That ability is her true legacy. Her influence didn't always show up in awards or chart positions, but in lineage. Mothers passed her albums to daughters, crate diggers rediscovered her during vinyl revivals, and streaming services introduced her to new listeners searching for depth in a shallow musical landscape. Among true music lovers, Miki Howard became less of a commercial act and more of a rite of passage. Why, then, was she overlooked? The reasons are layered. Part of it was timing. By the 1,990 seconds, when she should have been solidifying her place as one of the greats, the music industry was shifting toward hip-hop, infused R&B and younger crossover acts. The rich, jazzy textures and emotional ballads that defined her artistry were branded outdated. Neo-soul, which might have welcomed her, was still a decade away. She was caught in the gap, too soulful for top 40, too early for the revival that would celebrate her style. Part of it was also image. Miki wasn't chasing pop gloss or shock value. She wasn't easily packaged. She didn't mold herself to fit fleeting trends. She sang what she felt, and in a business that rewards spectacle over subtlety, that made her expendable. Add to that the double burden of racism and misogyny in the industry, and her fate becomes clearer. Opportunities shrank. Radio play dried up. Budgets vanished. For many female artists, especially black women, the industry has always been quicker to discard than to uplift once youth fades or once perfection slips. Miki Howard was no exception to that cruel rule, and yet, survival itself became part of her story. When Unsung aired in 2010, millions saw not just a fallen diva, but a survivor who had endured heartbreak, addiction, homelessness, and betrayal, and still found her way back to the stage. That honesty, that resilience, resonated in ways glossier success stories never could. It reintroduced her to the world, not as a relic, but as a living testament to endurance. For all the industry's neglect, her artistry never disappeared. Even in the smallest venues, her fans wept, sang along, and reminded her and themselves that what she did still mattered. Albums like Private Collection and I Choose to Be Happy may not have topped charts, but they carried truth, stripped down and fearless, echoing the same authenticity that defined her peak years. In the end, Miki Howard became something rarer than a mainstream celebrity. She became a hidden treasure, a singer's singer, a legend without the laurels. Her story is a reminder that greatness isn't always measured in awards or sales. Sometimes it's measured in the way a voice lingers in the soul, the way a lyric becomes someone's lifeline, the way an artist survives against all odds and still sings. And so, while radio stations may have stopped calling her name and award shows may have overlooked her contributions, the people never fully let her go. Her music has endured, not as nostalgia, but as living proof of what it means to sing the truth. That, perhaps, is the most powerful legacy of all. She had the voice of a jazz goddess, the beauty of a Hollywood star, and the soul of an R&B queen. From the very first note she ever sang, it was clear Miki Howard had been given a gift. Yet, in a world obsessed with trends and packaging, that gift was too often overlooked, ignored, or dismissed. The music industry clapped loudly when she rose, but turned its back just as quickly when she stumbled. And still, she never stopped singing. Through heartbreak, through addiction, through the crushing silence of an industry that erased her name, her voice remained. Smooth as silk, raw as heartbreak, it carried her through storms and became the constant that no executive, no gossip, no demon could take away. What does Miki Howard's story tell us? That talent alone isn't enough. That truth-telling can be punished in a business that prefers artifice. That black women in music, no matter how extraordinary, are too often discarded once they no longer fit the mold. But it also tells us something else. Resilience is its own form of triumph. Miki Howard never begged for attention. She never reinvented herself into something she wasn't. She remained herself flawed, honest, powerful, and for that, she paid the price of being underrated. Yet, being underrated is not the same as being forgotten. Her songs still live in the voices of fans who sing them decades later, in the younger artists who quietly cite her as an influence, and in the hearts of those who needed her music to survive their own storms. So the question lingers, should Miki Howard be mentioned alongside Aretha, Chaka, Anita, and Whitney? If legacy is measured not just by awards, but by impact, by survival, by truth, then the answer is yes. Absolutely yes. Miki Howard deserved more. More recognition, more celebration, more love, and maybe, just maybe, it's not too late to give it to her. What's your favorite Miki Howard song or memory? Drop it in the comments, we'd love to hear your story. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more journeys into the icons who should have never been forgotten.